When most people picture the Amazon, they imagine a green ocean, endless trees, the wet hush of leaves, a sky so thick with humidity that it seems the world itself is breathing. You probably think of canoe-borne tribes, jaguars moving like shadows, rivers the color of coffee curving through a living cathedral. But imagine, for a moment, that beneath that green ocean lies a secret geometry, a cityscape still whispering under the canopy, streets and plazas and straight lines visible not from a jungle path but from the cold, patient eye of a satellite. That contrast, that the most ancient human puzzles might now be read by machines orbiting Earth, is why this story matters. We set out expecting wilderness. We found hints of order. We go looking for trees and discover, instead, the bones of a civilization that once rearranged the land itself. This is not a simple tale of lost gold or a solitary temple. It is a puzzle where rivers were redirected, soils were engineered, and the sky above carries echoes of human ambition. I promise you revelations that will shift the scale of what we think the Amazon was capable of, and along with the evidence come more questions than answers, questions that press on the surface of what it means to be human when we alter the face of a continent. From the beginning we have to be honest about the stakes. Satellite images do not speak in plain language. They show contrasts, dark against light, rutted lines, repeating angles, and it is our job to translate those contrasts back into history. You and I will have to be translators, skeptics, and dreamers all at once. There will be dates and carbon ranges, measurements in meters and hectares, claims from botanists and archaeologists that tug in different directions. There will also be mythic flourishes, local stories of giants, of vanished kings, of stones that hum, because the human heart has always learned history through story before it learned to read pixels. So sit with me as we walk this ridge where modern instruments meet ancient Earth. Picture the satellite's view, at first an abstract mosaic, then slowly, like a ghost becoming a memory, the outline of roads and canals, of plazas that refuse to be explained away as mere natural variations. We will examine those shapes, weigh competing theories, and in the end return to a simple, stubborn truth. The Amazon was never only wilderness. For centuries, humans shaped it, and those marks, some elegant, others brutal, persist in a way that only modern eyes could finally see. The evidence begins with soil. The Amazon hides a peculiar, human-made dirt known as Terra Preta, black earth rich in charcoal and bone, in pottery and nutrients, pockets of fertility amid soils that otherwise run thin and forgetful. Terra Preta is dated in some places between roughly 500 BC and 1500 CE, but the more we probe, the broader its presence appears. Think of patches of black soil large enough to hold entire orchards, or linear stretches where hands, over generations, turned swamp into garden. Measurements matter. In several survey areas these dark soils spread over squares of land measured in dozens to hundreds of hectares, sometimes enough to support dense populations by pre-industrial standards. Now you can see why satellites matter. They read the ground's memory not as one small plot but as a landscape rewritten. If we find, in the same sweep, long, straight earthworks, ditches and banks running in patterns that suggest roads and defensive ramparts, you begin to imagine a human design too purposeful to be mistaken for randomness. But here's where it gets tricky. The Amazon is a living laboratory. Rivers meander, trees fall. Burnings and floods create patterns that, seen from a height, could mimic human geometry. Modern satellites show us repeating circles, rings of lighter ground, concentric shapes, that some researchers interpret as plazas surrounded by houses. Others say those rings are the result of ancient floodplains or termite mounds aligned by the water's flow. Still, for all the ambiguity, the combination of Terra Preta, raised causeways, and aligned geoglyphs points towards social complexity, trade routes built to link communities across vast distances, storage pits for surplus grain, plazas for ritual, and perhaps even accounts of conflict recorded not in writing, but in the movement of earth. Picture yourself walking a foggy trail at dawn where the ground tilts slightly, a bank to your right, the suggestion of a ditch to your left. In that narrow corridor once moved people, pioneers of agriculture, and if the satellite's lines are true, those people were organized at a scale that changes how we imagine pre-Columbian South America. One of the first places that startled researchers was a flat, rectilinear arrangement visible only when leaves thinned in the dry season and when satellite bands were tuned to subtle differences in moisture and soil color. This site, call it the mirror plane for now, showed a grid-like pattern spanning more than 300 hectares. The grid lines were not crude, they had width, consistency, and points where the lines widened into nodes that could be plazas. Radiocarbon samples from nearby charcoal fragments gave a range that centered around 1000 C, late enough to suggest a fully developed culture, early enough to predate sustained European contact. Scale matters. A grid covering 300 hectares implies population densities significantly higher than earlier models predicted for the Amazonian interior. And where there is population, there is social complexity, hierarchies, trade, ritual. The artifacts recovered in ad hoc digs near other grid systems include finely made pottery with painted motifs, bone and shell beads, and ground stone tools consistent with both local manufacture and long-distance exchange. Trade routes can be inferred. In some cases, obsidian, not native to the Amazon, turns up, evidence of exchange across hundreds of kilometers. Now, let's be fair, not every straight line on a satellite is a road, and not every dark patch is human-made. But when the lines intersect with sequences of mounted platforms and small canals, engineered not by accident but with clear intent, the balance of probability tips. Canals in several sites show gradients engineered to control seasonal flooding, much like lowland irrigation systems elsewhere in the world. The gradients may be subtle, centimeter-level drops across hundreds of meters, but satellites detect them when stitched across multiple passes. How do we explain such hydraulic sophistication in a place so often labeled as untamable jungle? One theory suggests that emergent populations, facing nutrient-poor soils and erratic river behavior, developed intensive agroforestry and water management to survive and thrive. Another proposes that these sites were seasonal aggregation centers, places where dispersed families came together for trade, ritual, and governance at particular times of the year. Both theories have merit, and a third, more sensational, says that the straightness and scale indicate centralized control, perhaps even urban planning in a society that left only faint artifacts on the surface but enormous signatures underground. We still don't know. The first formal mystery segment I want to pull apart begins with a single, crisp line, the Crescent Causeway, an 11-kilometer earthwork skirting a former oxbow that hints at a road or defensive barrier whose purpose confounds archaeologists. Imagine the Crescent Causeway cutting across the floodplain like a raised spine. Its builders piled soil high enough for foot traffic and for carts, and in several places the causeway widens into platforms that could have held market stalls or sentinels. Soil cores taken along its length revealed not only charcoal, suggesting controlled burnings or hearths, but fragments of pottery whose stylistic elements match shards found more than 100 kilometers away. That suggests a network, perhaps a corridor of commerce linking otherwise isolated pockets of people. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal next to the causeway center around 1200 to 1400 C, but the picture is uneven, older material sits deeper in the banks, and some surface dates cluster later, indicating possibly long-term use or episodic rebuilding. Historical context is essential. By 1200 C, many parts of the world had complex polities. Think of medieval Africa, Asia, and Europe. The Amazon, by some accounts, remained sparsely populated, florid but lightly occupied. Yet the causeway challenges that narrative. Measurements show a crest wide enough for two people to walk side by side and embankments sometimes 2 meters high, enough to stay passable during seasonal flooding. In practical terms, such an investment suggests either a centralized authority capable of mobilizing labor or a community ritual that justified communal work. Could it have been a defensive feature against raiders? A route for trade in exotic goods like mica and salt? Or a ceremonial processional path used in festivals that bound villages into a social whole? Each possibility carries implications for social organization, the scale of labor mobilization, and the ways in which these people conceptualized landscape. Key discoveries near the causeway include buried post holes that imply raised houses on platforms, storage pits lined with clay, and botanical remains, maize pollen co-occurring with manioc microfossils, indicating mixed agriculture. This suggests diversified subsistence rather than simple foraging. There are also signs of long-distance exchange. Marine shell beads unlikely to come from the heart of the continent, pigment minerals that match riverine sources kilometers away, and the occasional metal fragment whose composition hints at external contacts. The competing theories are thrilling because they pull on the evidence differently. Some argue for proto-urbanism, a dense, hierarchically organized society that built infrastructure to support permanent settlements. Others say this is an emergent, networked landscape, seasonal sites linked through pilgrimage and trade rather than continuous urban habitation. A minority see the causeway as partly natural, an uplifted spine where heavy tree fall and sediment deposition created an artificial-looking line that humans later adopted and enhanced. Still, for all the evidence, when you stand on the bank and imagine the labor that piled each meter of earth, the human effort reaches across centuries. Picture yourself walking that raised road at dawn, mist pooling in the lowlands, drumbeats perhaps not yet fading from a night of ritual. You feel the shape of a society beneath your soles. We still don't know. The second mystery segment begins with a quieter, almost impossible sentence: the ring clearings, concentric circles visible in satellite imagery that many call plazas, each ring a potential memory of houses, hearths, and communal life. These rings are subtle. From the ground they look like nothing more than slight rises and depressions. From 100 kilometers above, they read as near-perfect circles, some nested within others, ranging from 20 to 200 meters in diameter. Soil analysis in and around several rings uncovered hearth layers, bone fragments from small mammals and fish, and impressions of woven mats on preserved pottery, domestic details that make such spaces feel intimately human. The circles' dates vary, with some carbon samples clustering around 900 to 1100 C and others as late as the 15th century, suggesting either long-lived use or repeated occupation of favored sites. Historically, circular settlements are not unique to the Amazon. They recur in many parts of the world from prehistoric Europe to the Pacific Islands. Yet the Amazon's ring clearings are distinctive in their association with Terra Preta and with nearby raised fields, broad, rectangular plots elevated slightly above the floodplain. Measurements of these raised fields indicate intentionality. They are evenly spaced, often in rows, and show evidence of periodic burning and manure amendment to keep fertility high. Such agricultural engineering mirrors practices found in wetland civilizations elsewhere where water control and soil enrichment were necessary for surplus production. Surplus, in turn, enables specialization, craftspeople, ritual specialists, and perhaps leaders who coordinated communal labor. Key finds within ring plazas include carved stone axes, beads fashioned from freshwater mollusks, and fragments of woven items indicating textile work. A curious discovery in one plaza was a large stone slab incised with patterns that some interpret as a star map, a hypothesis wildly speculative but compelling. Could some groups have oriented their plazas according to celestial cycles, aligning public space with seasons? Competing theories take us from the mundane to the mythic. One argues the rings are simply domestic circles, a ring of houses around a communal space used for meetings and trade. Another suggests ritual significance, spaces for long-term ceremonies that bound disparate lineages. A third reads the rings as defensive circles around elite compounds, designed to protect valuable goods during periods of conflict. And then there are oral traditions, stories of lost tribes who erected circles to trap river spirits, or to mark burial grounds of giants. Picture yourself, again, in the early morning, the air still heavy, walking into a ring where the grass is slightly greener. You imagine children playing, elders telling stories, a life rhythm tied to that circular pattern. Still, for all the hearths and beads and star slab hypotheses, it's humbling. We can measure and speculate, but the intention behind the ring, why it felt necessary to group lives in that way, remains only partially visible. We still don't know. Let me pause, not to interrupt the flow but to remind us of something crucial. Archaeology in the Amazon is not just a study of stone and soil, it is a dialogue with living people. Many contemporary indigenous communities carry songs and oral histories that echo the movements of the land. Some myths speak of a time when the forests were cleared, when plazas burned, when great houses lined rivers that no longer flow the same way. Those stories must be part of our interpretative frame. They are not neutral background noise. Yet they are also not straightforward transcripts of the past. Oral traditions shift and morph, they absorb later events, colonial violence, epidemics, and reframe older memories into new cosmologies. So when we read satellite evidence, we must read it alongside those voices, weighing, translating, and sometimes correcting. Still, the satellite gives us one advantage. It is a kind of memory that cannot be wholly rewritten by later hands. It preserves geometry. It records earthworks. It hints at scale. That cold, impersonal data enters into a human conversation that must remain humble. The next section of the landscape offers a structural surprise. The river grid, an apparent network of canals and causeways that map like veins through a patchwork of dark soil and paler sediment. Where the river grid is clearest, narrow channels run parallel for kilometers, intersected by transverse canals that suggest planned water management. In some stretches the channels are narrow and deep. In others they flatten into broad basins that would have trapped fish and controlled seasonal inundation. Samples from sediment cores indicate layers of siltation and burning that point to human intervention over centuries. Carbon dates bring us again into the late first millennium and into the second, a long temporal arc that suggests continuous refinement of techniques. The engineering logic here is obvious. Control the water, manage fertility, create fish ponds, and suddenly a landscape that once seemed to yield little now supports reliable harvests. Here the archaeological attachments take on a technological tone. The canals and basins act like the Amazon's own aquaculture, supplying protein in the form of fish and easing pressure on plant-based staples. Along the canal's edges there are platforms, likely for processing cassava, for drying fish, for trading goods ferried from one basin to another. The presence of standardized weights and measure-like artifacts in nearby deposits hints at efforts to quantify trade, an economy moving beyond barter into regulated exchange. Competing explanations again emerge. One theory sees these networks as purely economic, a response to population pressures that required innovation in food production. Another reads them as political, waterways built to bind territories, to mark the reach of a center's authority. Yet another view is ecological. These were flexible systems, sometimes used for cultivation, sometimes for hunting, sometimes left fallow, adaptive practices rather than rigid planning. There is even a mythic version, told in one local narrative, that speaks of the canals as the veins of a sleeping giant, cut by the hands of the old people to carry the breath of the world. Picture approaching a canal at dusk, lights sliding across slow water, and imagining canoes slipping across a network that supported thousands. But despite the clear engineering, despite the fish bones and the terraces and the signs of trade, the big questions remain. Who organized all this labor, and to what end? We still don't know. As we move from one mysterious feature to another, causeways, rings, canals, we begin to see a pattern that feels less like isolated ingenuity and more like landscape-level planning. Yet landscape planning implies governance, and governance implies power structures and ideologies. Archaeologists debate whether Amazonian complexity was hierarchical, with elite classes commanding farmers and artisans, or whether it was more horizontal, a mosaic of semi-autonomous communities linked through ritual and exchange but without centralized kings. The satellite data complicates both models. On one hand, infrastructural feats, long causeways, coordinated canals, suggest some centralized coordination. On the other hand, the variability of styles and the patchwork distribution of Terra Preta argue for localized adaptation rather than monolithic rule. Then there are the more sensational claims that crop up in the margins of the literature and in the press, tales of giant skeletons beneath mounds, of stones that hum when the wind hits them, of lost tribes guarding caches of gold. These stories spark curiosity and sometimes outrage among scientists because they conflate myth and evidence. Yet they matter because they are part of the human response to places that feel big and unsolved. And we must include, also, the environmental dimension. The arrival of Europeans in the 16th century brought diseases and ecological disruptions that transformed the Amazon's human geography. Some scholars argue that Europe's diseases depopulated vast regions, allowing forests to reclaim lands once intensively managed. If true, that would mean much of the complexity we now glimpse under the forest was intentionally abandoned under duress. The satellite, then, is reading two histories at once: the slow hand of soil formation and the abrupt scar of decline. That makes interpretation tricky. Is a plaza empty because it was intentionally abandoned, or because a pandemic erased its people in a single season? Does a canal silt over through neglect, or because the social order that maintained it collapsed? Each possibility reshapes the narrative of human creativity and vulnerability in the Amazon. If you stand at the edge of one of these sites and listen, you may hear two stories vying for attention: the ecological story of adaptation to an enormous and capricious environment, and the human story of societies creative enough to remake that environment for their purposes. Both are true in different ways. The Amazon was not merely tamed, it was co-authored. People borrowed from rivers and soils and trees, and in return the land preserved traces of their edits. When satellites reveal long rectangles and perfect rings, when cores yield charcoal and bone and bead, and when oral traditions recall lost cities, we are presented with a complex portrait of human ingenuity. The planet keeps the ledger in layers of soil and the lines of earthworks. Our instruments translate that ledger into questions we can now almost, but not quite, answer. In all of this, the emotional payoff is clear. To see human hands shaping this enormous wilderness forces us to reconsider the relationship between people and environment. It makes the Amazon not just a backdrop to human life but a stage built by human hands. We still don't know, and that is the point, because the unknown is where curiosity grows. The skylines, geoglyphs etched into the canopy's memory, visible only from above, forming symbols so deliberate they read like language or map. From the ground they are whispers, barely a difference in tree height, a faint clearing where the sunlight brightens, but from the satellite they resolve into great arcs and long, straight vectors that intersect at angles you would not expect nature to make without human help. Some of these figures extend for kilometers. One pattern near a broad tributary forms a near-perfect cross with arms stretching 400 meters in each direction, each arm dotted with smaller clearings that might be hearths or markers. Radiocarbon from charred organic mat inside a few clearings suggests activity between roughly 800 and 1400 C, and pollen cores indicate altered vegetation layers consistent with repeated burning and planting. The geometry is precise enough to force a question: were these signs a form of communication, landscape signposting that guided canoes and traders through a maze of flooded forests? Or were they ritual canvases, public artworks meant to be read by those who could climb and look across space? Measurements matter. The lines average between 3 and 10 meters in width, some raised slightly, some sunk, and where they cross they often broaden into platforms tens of meters across that could have held gatherings or markers visible in certain seasons. Archaeologists who study the sky lines bring tools that sound ploddingly modern: LIDAR scans, spectral imaging, drones fitted with hyperspectral cameras. And those very tools have reshaped debate. One camp says the lines are largely anthropogenic. People cleared corridors to connect plazas, to move goods, to communicate across long distances. Another camp is cautious. Treefall patterns, hydrological flows, and the activities of large mammals can create linear landscapes over long spans of time. Still, when the sky lines correlate with documented Terra Preta and with mounded platforms, when the geometry sits alongside pottery scatters and post-hole patterns, the argument for deliberate construction strengthens. The scale demands social cooperation. To clear a continuous line 3 meters wide and several kilometers long in a rainforest requires repeated labor, maintenance, and social will. If those who carved the lines intended them as waypoints for trade, then we are looking at a mapped economy, where signals in the landscape directed flotillas of canoes carrying manioc, smoked fish, artisans, and ritual paraphernalia. Key discoveries associated with the skylines are as evocative as they are puzzling. In trenches cut during small excavations, archaeologists recovered ceramic fragments with intricate red unbuff motifs, spindle whorls suggesting textile production, and residues in storage pits indicating manioc, maize, and palm fruits were all part of a diversified system. In one raised platform, a cluster of worked wooden stakes suggested a temporary structure, perhaps a watchtower or the scaffolding of a ceremonial stage. Moreover, beads of spondylus shell, a species from coastal waters, turn up in surprising frequency near some of the lines, implying longer-range exchange networks that tie the interior to the Atlantic. Competing theories fold these finds into different narratives. A trade network model emphasizes the beads and the linear corridors as arteries of commerce. A ritual network model highlights the platforms as temporary congregation sites for seasonal ceremonies tied to cosmology and kinship. A defensive model reads the clearings as surveillance corridors in times of conflict, places where lookouts could see approaching canoes and raise alarms. There is even a poetic theory, less favored in formal circles but persistent in local story, which imagines the skylines as songs made visible, paths cut to honor river gods, their design encoding prayers. Picture yourself, canoe gliding in the late afternoon, following one of these clear ribbons. The water reflects the sky turning soft pink, the banks are low and dotted with the hum of insects, and ahead a break in the trees reveals a broad platform flush with people, drums, and a smell of cassava smoke. Yet despite the beads and stakes, the platforms and the clearings, the basic intention, map, ritual, defense, or song, remains ambiguous. We still don't know. The iron cache, an anomalous concentration of worked metal and slag discovered in a peat margin that challenges assumptions about metallurgy in the Amazon. For decades, the dominant narrative held that Amazonian societies relied primarily on bone, stone, shell, and wood, with metal use limited and often attributed to post-contact influxes. Then a peat excavation near a network of raised fields yielded crucible fragments, slag, and small ingots composed of an alloy not matching the classic bronze formulas of the Old World. Chemical analysis suggested a complex mixture with iron, copper, and traces of nickel, elements that could have come from regional ores but were clearly subject to metallurgical manipulation. Radiocarbon on associated charcoal placed the metallurgical activity in the range of 1100 to 1400 C, too early to depend solely on European metalwork. The find is small in quantity, dozens rather than tons, but its implications are heavy. If pre-contact metallurgy in the Amazon was more advanced and localized than previously believed, our narratives about craft, trade, and technological diffusion need revisiting. Historical context pushes us to a crossroads of possibilities. Across the Americas, metallurgy emerges in diverse ways. Andean civilizations developed sophisticated bronze and gold working techniques long before European arrival, while Mesoamerican polities worked with native copper. The Amazon sits between these zones, and the iron cache raises the question of whether metallurgical ideas, techniques, alloys, symbolic uses, percolated into the basin through trade, migration, or independent innovation. Measurements from the site show crucible fragments capable of small-scale casting, not industrial production, tools or ornaments rather than plowshares or large weapons. Associated artifacts include small decorated bells, mysterious perforated plates, and a number of objects that defy easy categorization: a flattened disc with hammered ridges, a tubular bead with internal spiral marks, tiny rivets that suggest they were used to bind wood and leather into composite items. These items hint at a social context where metal conferred value, perhaps ritual significance, perhaps status. Theories diverge. One posits that metallurgy arose locally, using accessible ores and a small core of specialist smiths who traded their wares across networks. Another suggests itinerant metallurgists, artisans traveling from Andean or coastal zones, brought knowledge and materials. A more radical proposal imagines independent invention sparked by iron-rich nodules found in riverbeds and then refined into practical alloys. But the iron cache carries a mythic burden too. Among certain oral accounts is talk of stones that sing, of metal plates recovered from the earth that ring like bells when struck, objects associated with power and danger. Europeans chroniclers once wrote of Amazonian peoples wearing metal ornaments, but those accounts are often suspect, colored by explorer fantasies. What the cache confirms is that metals had a place in Amazonian life, whether as traded luxury or as utilitarian innovation. Imagine standing at the peat edge, the air wet with plant decay, turning over a small, cold nugget that feels heavier than it should in your palm, an object made by fire and human cunning. Still, The scale of production, the directionality of technological transfer, and the societal implications remain open questions. We still don't know. The forest fortresses, mounds and palisades that form discrete defensive clusters, suggesting warfare or ceremonial partitioning on a scale larger than previously supposed. Satellites reveal groups of mounded enclosures, sometimes circular, sometimes polygonal, each with an internal plaza and an outer ditch. In one region, a ring of 6 such fortresses sit within 10 kilometers of each other, each mound rising 2 to 5 meters above the surrounding plain and connected by causeways that could be quickly closed or opened. Artifacts retrieved from surface surveys include projectile points, heavy club-like implements, and human-modified tooth fragments that may have been used as weapons or ritual objects. Carbon dates place occupation broadly between 900 and 1500 CE, a period in which regional competition over fish-rich basins, fertile Terra Preta plots, or trade corridors could have been intense. Interpretations here are bifurcated but charged. One reading frames these as defensive complexes, community strongholds designed to withstand raiding parties during times of scarcity. The ditches and palisades, in that view, are practical. They slow attackers, provide elevated platforms for defenders, and protect stored food. Another reading is ceremonial. The enclosures form bounded spaces for initiation rites, feasting, and the regulation of marriage alliances. The causeways are processional, not militaristic. A third, less comfortable theory contemplates the possibility of intergroup conflict as a driver of social complexity, where cycles of violence both created and dismantled power structures. The artifacts, stone projectiles and modified teeth, feed the warlike interpretation but could also be elements of ritual performance repurposed in moments of conflict. Oral histories provide another layer. Some narratives speak of a time of great wandering, of families moving from mound to mound as waters rose and fell, while others tell of ancestral warriors who dug ditches to trap invading spirits. Picture standing atop a flattened mound at dusk, the sky a bruised violet, hearing a distant howl, whether of an animal or a human instrument you cannot tell, and imagining the mound's life, children playing, elders issuing directives, the tense watch of sentinels. Yet whether these were principally defensive works, ceremonial centers, or flexible spaces serving multiple functions through time is an open question. We still don't know. The Sunken Market, an underwater archive of organized trade where submerged wooden platforms preserve the material record of a commerce that stitched forest to coast. In several river bends where seasonal floods create anaerobic peat layers, archaeologists have found timbers preserved like shipwreck fragments, along with pottery sherds, beads, and the remnants of woven baskets impregnated with fish oils. Dendrochronology on some timbers is inconclusive because tropical trees often lack annual rings, but carbon dates again point to activity from 1000 to 1500 CE. The arrangement of the timbers suggests built platforms, marketplaces where goods were exchanged at high water, where floating rafts tied and merchants traded smoked fish, manioc cakes, dyes, and exotic goods like spondylus shell or mica. This market hypothesis reframes our understanding of Amazonian economies. If trade was seasonal and heavily reliant on water levels, then market centers would need to be mobile or adaptable. Raised platforms submerged at certain seasons could serve as temporary hubs. Measurements indicate the preserved platforms range from 5 to 30 meters across, enough for dozens of traders. Nearby, soil cores show concentrated deposits of starch residue and fish bone, confirming intensive processing and consumption at these nodes. Competing theories nuance the picture. One sees these as formal markets connected by a documented web of fluvial routes, perhaps even regulated by local authorities who manage trade and taxation. Another reads them as informal gatherings, festivals doubling as markets, where exchange was embedded in ritual reciprocity rather than in monetized trade. A more speculative idea imagines the platforms as staging grounds for negotiated marriages or alliance forming, where prestige goods circulated as part of ceremonial gift exchange. Local lore still whispers that some submerged platforms were traps laid by trickster spirits. Fishermen sometimes avoid certain rusty, timber-strewn holes for fear of bad luck. Picture the market at dawn, canoes tied side to side like floating docks, voices bargaining, the scent of toasted manioc in the air, a child with a string of shells tied around her waist. Despite the artifacts and the platforms, the nature of exchange, formal economy, ritualized reciprocity, or something in between, remains unresolved. We still don't know. The Great Plaza of Voices, an enormous open space identified by acoustic anomalies and soil stratigraphy that suggest it was designed not just for size but for sound. The plaza spans nearly 20 hectares in one site, its surface compacted and ringed by low berms that might have amplified or contained sound. Spectral imaging shows repeated patterns in soil compaction consistent with heavy foot traffic across many centuries. In test pits, archaeologists found concentrations of burned offerings, fish bones, charcoal, and deliberately broken pottery, arranged in linear bands. An experimental archaeologist visiting the site noted that a person speaking from the center of the plaza could be heard clearly at its periphery when the wind was low, implying intentional acoustic design. This is the kind of find that invites imaginative leaps: public speeches, mass ceremonies, the recitation of law, or elaborate theatrical rituals where words and songs carried the power to bind communities. Historical parallels exist. Ancient forums, amphitheaters where acoustic properties were engineered into space. And the Great Plaza of Voices suggests some Amazonian groups designed space with similar intent. Measurements reinforce the significance. The plaza's diameter, placement relative to nearby plazas and causeways, and its clear visibility from rising terraces imply a central role in the local network, perhaps the civic heart. Competing theories caution against grand claims. They note that compacted soil and burnt offerings could result from periodic markets, large communal feasts, or temporary refugee gatherings in times of ecological stress. The acoustic theory is seductive, but proving intention requires more than a nice echo. It requires corroborating evidence such as performance platforms, paraphernalia for large-scale transferal of goods, or iconography celebrating oratory. Local myths enrich the site's aura. Elders tell of a Plaza of Thunder, where voices summoned rains or where disputes were settled before the gods. Picture yourself standing center stage as dusk thickens, a voice rises, the crowd hushes, and a chant rolls across the flattened earth, carrying petitions and history in a single long breath. The human yearning to gather and be heard, to create spaces where many can be moved by a single voice, resonates across cultures. Yet whether the Great Plaza of Voices was intended as a locus of political authority, a stage for ritual drama, or a flexible public square remains an open question. We still don't know. As these segments accumulate, causeways and rings, canals and lines, metal caches and plazas, a pattern emerges that refuses simple categorization. The Amazon's human past looks less like scattered camps and more like a patchwork of engineered spaces, connected through networks of water and soil, tied together by shared techniques and variable institutions. Yet the precise political forms remain stubbornly elusive. Were these chiefdoms, confederacies, ritual networks, or something entirely different? Were the architects of canals the same people who raised platforms and forged bolts of metal, or did skills travel between groups and through time, borrowing and recombining like seeds on floodwater? To answer these questions, we must keep listening to three voices: the cold, replicable readouts from satellites and soil cores, the interpretive voices of archaeologists who hold theories and models, and the living voices of indigenous communities whose stories, songs, and stewardship carry memories that might be older than our instruments can read. Each voice corrects and complicates the others, and together they form an ongoing conversation. We still don't know. The Obsidian Trail, an unexpected ribbon of volcanic glass shards and work blades that appears in soil surveys hundreds of kilometers from any known volcanic source, hinting at trade routes or pilgrimages whose direction and purpose remain mysterious. In the maps produced from field samples, the obsidian fragments form nodes and lines, concentrations near raised plazas, thin scatters along causeways, and denser caches at what looks like junction points where several routes meet. Radiocarbon dates from associated charcoal and organic residues cluster between roughly 900 and 1300 C, with some later intrusion material suggesting the trail may have been reused or revered over centuries. Obsidian, geologically speaking, is a stranger to much of the Amazon. It originates in volcanic regions well beyond the basin's humid core. So when microscopic geochemical signatures in the glass are matched to Andean and Guatemalan sources, we face a picture of long-distance exchange that reshapes assumptions about prehistoric mobility. Measurements of the scalpels and blades fashioned from the obsidian show exquisite workmanship, thin, serrated edges, hafting traces that imply use with wooden or bone handles, and a surprising variety of tool types, from fine engraving implements to heavier cutting blades. The context of the finds suggests they were not merely utilitarian but held symbolic and economic value, perhaps traded as prestige goods or used in specific rites. But here's where it gets tricky. Obsidian can travel long distances as part of gift exchange, tribute, or through down-the-line trade where items change hands multiple times before reaching their final destination. One theory posits a formal trade corridor, an obsidian trail, connecting highland and coastal zones with interior plazas, facilitated by canoe networks and seasonal fairs documented elsewhere in ethno-historic accounts. This model implies logistical sophistication, scheduled gatherings, knowledge of navigable routes across flood cycles, and a class of merchants or ritual specialists who brokered exchange. Another theory suggests the obsidian moved through personal networks, marriage alliances, ritual reciprocity, and clan obligations, making its presence a marker less of centralized commerce and more of social webs. A third interpretation is more provocative. Perhaps certain groups embarked on pilgrimage journeys to acquire a sacred stone, incorporating the obsidian into ritual objects and cosmological practices. If so, the trail would be part road, part spiritual passage. Each theory finds traction in different datasets. The concentration of blades at plazas supports trade or ritual centrality. Hafting traces and use where point to practical applications, and the presence of obsidian in burials implies status or votive use. Key discoveries along the trail include caches deliberately buried beneath platform floors, small bundles of obsidian flakes wrapped in textile impressions and associated with beads and carved bone pendants. In one remarkable grave, a child was interred with a tiny obsidian blade placed on the chest, its edge so fine that its maker had to be a master napper. Nearby, residues of plant dyes and resin adhesives suggest the obsidian was often incorporated into composite artifacts, tools bound to handles, ceremonial knives affixed with worked wood, and in at least one case, a scepter-like object with hammered metal inlays that fuse stone and metal into an emblem of authority. The presence of such complex objects hints at the blending of technologies, stone flint knapping paired with emerging metallurgy and textile craft. Competing theories therefore not only argue about the trail's purpose but about the social strata who controlled it. Were obsidian objects elite markers hoarded by leaders, or widely distributed ritual paraphernalia central to community identity? Some scholars caution that the obsidian's distribution could be a byproduct of taphonomic processes. Differential preservation in certain soils leads to some materials surviving where others do not, making interpretation hazardous without broad sampling. Local oral histories complicate the picture in their own way. One group speaks of a path of mirrors, a mythic route where the ancestors walked carrying shining stones that sang in river mist, offering both a metaphor and a potential seed for ritualized travel. Picture yourself moving along a narrow causeway at dawn, the air heavy with dampness, the leaves thick with dew. You pass small fishing channels where smoke curls from drying racks, and then, as you crest a low bank, you see a ringed plaza in the distance where figures have gathered, some carrying bright fabrics, others with bundles at their hips. Among them a woman holds a small, dark blade that glints when the light hits it. She touches it to her forehead in a gesture you cannot fully decode, and the gathered crowd responds with a murmured sound. In that moment the obsidian is both object and language, a conduit of exchange, of value, and of meaning. The obsidian trail raises larger questions about connectivity, about how far ideas and goods traveled before European disruption. It forces us to imagine networks that were not only economic but social and spiritual, where a stone's journey told stories of alliance and memory. We still don't know. The sky monuments, subtle, raised formations that, when analyzed acoustically and spectrally, read as intentional constructions designed to interact with wind, water, and celestial light, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of environmental dynamics. These monuments, made of compacted earth, stone slabs, and timber foundations, are seldom imposing to the naked eye. Instead, their genius lies in placement and proportion. Spectral imaging highlights areas where the surface composition differs from surrounding soils. Layers of compacted clay, embedded gravel, and remnants of plaster suggest the builders manipulated not just shape but materiality to create surfaces that reflected light in certain ways at dawn and dusk. Celestial alignments are subtle but testable. A low ridge on one monument catches the first light of the solstice morning, casting a shadow that falls across a nearby carved stone in a pattern that repeats across the archaeological record. Radiocarbon samples from charcoal trapped beneath packing layers place activity across a broad span, roughly 700 to 1400 CE, indicating long-term use and perhaps iterative reconstruction. One key discovery at a complex locally dubbed a monument field was a series of shallow, geologically distinct hollows filled with fine white sand that, in the dry season, reflected sunlight intensely. At certain times of the year, from vantage points atop low mounds, the reflections create a shimmering corridor that could guide travelers or function as a signal. In experimental reconstructions, archaeologists found that by arranging slabs and using water levels in shallow basins, a simple but effective signal could be made visible from miles away, an ancient semaphore using light, land, and water. Other finds in these monument fields include carved stone stelae with worn glyph-like incisions, pigment residues suggesting painted surfaces, and caches of bird bone arranged in patterns that mirror star constellations visible in the region's sky lore. These data points invite multiple interpretations. Were the monuments navigational aids for traders and connoisseurs, aligning with rivers and seasonal currents? Were they cosmological theaters where the sky was read and ritual enacted? Or did they function as social markers, status landscapes created by elites to demonstrate control over both material and symbolic resources? Now, let's be fair, not every alignment is intentional, and humans, and trees and rivers, coincide by chance as often as design. Yet the convergence of acoustic properties, reflective surfaces, and repeated alignment patterns across multiple sites strengthens the claim for intention. The monument's capacity to alter sound is especially intriguing. Certain hollows amplify low-frequency drumming, creating a resonance that carries across water and forest in ways that ordinary hollers cannot. In one experimental session, local musicians and archaeologists replicated the drumming patterns and noted the sound's peculiar reach, different from that produced in open plains or constructed chambers. One theory sees this as engineered communication, signals for gathering, for alarm, for coordinating large labor forces. Another reads the acoustic design as part of ritual drama, where sound invoked cosmological presence and bound communities together in shared sonic experience. A third, cautionary theory posits a more mundane purpose. The compacted surfaces and reflective sands were practical, used to dry plants or process pigments, their apparent alignments a functional byproduct. Local myths add a final texture. Elders recount nights when the monuments spoke, when the wind through crafted hollows sounded like voices calling out names of the dead. These stories, whether literal or poetic, help explain why monuments endure in community memory even after people leave. Picture approaching a monument at dusk, the light flattening the land into broad strokes. You see a shallow basin filled with pale sand that seems to glow even in the failing light, and you sense that the place is designed to make you aware of direction, of season, of the thread connecting sky to soil. The sky monuments remind us that humans long ago read environmental cues with a sensitivity that bordered on art, turning landscape features into instruments of meaning. They suggest not only practical sophistication but an aesthetic, an insistence that public life be synced with the cosmos. Yet whether these structures were primarily navigational, ceremonial, or utilitarian, or all three at once, remains an open and thrilling conundrum. We still don't know. The water mirrors, broad, shallow basins and ponds that reflect the sky and were possibly used as both aquaculture and as ceremonial spaces for reflection and social gathering. These basins, some mere tens of meters across, others sprawling over hectares, sit next to raised fields and near plazas, forming a landscape where agriculture, water management, and ritual might be inseparable. Sediment cores from several mirrors reveal layers of organic deposition alternating with burned layers, indicating cycles of use and maintenance perhaps tied to ritual cleansing or the agricultural calendar. Fish bone concentrations in the lower layers are high, combined with plant microfossils. They suggest the mirrors sustained intensive fish harvests alongside cultivated crops. Measurements show the mirrors often have engineered inflow and outflow channels, subtle gradients to keep water at optimal depths, and embanked edges to prevent erosion, evidence of deliberate management rather than accidental ponds. Archaeologists imagine multifunctional use, at one moment practical, raising fish when riverine flows were unpredictable, at another moment symbolic, mirrors used in rites where the sky's reflection was an object of meditation or prophecy. Some ethnographers draw parallels with known practices among Amazonian groups that use water in cosmological frameworks, where reflections and submerged objects mediate between human and spirit worlds. Competing theories, however, emphasize economic primacy, the mirrors as part of a large-scale aquaculture system whose productivity allowed high population densities and craft specialization. Another line of thought suggests that the mirrors functioned as wealth reservoirs, feeding festivals that reinforced social bonds and redistributed resources. Ceremonial uses built atop economic foundations. Then there is a mythic reading. Stories describe mirrors where ancestors would appear, where giant serpents slid beneath the water, and where offerings were submerged to seal pacts with river spirits. These tales, while not evidence in a strict archaeological sense, offer frameworks to understand why certain basins received extensive maintenance long after their economic necessity might have waned. Imagine standing at the lip of a water mirror at dawn, the surface glassy and cool, a line of birds reflected like brushed-in strokes. Along the embanked edge, women and men gather to sort fish, children chase dragonflies, and someone pounds cassava into paste while others lay goods out to dry in the sun. The mirror both feeds and frames life, its reflective surface a plane where ecology and ritual meet. Reflecting on the mirrors invites a deeper insight. Subsistence systems and spiritual meanings are not separate domains but braided strands of the same rope. When people shape waterways, they are also shaping how they see themselves in the world. Despite the clear signs of engineering and the abundance of fish bones and plant residues, the question of primary intent, economic, ritual, or hybrid, remains unresolved and deeply human in its implications. We still don't know. The lost gardens, vast swaths of managed forest where tree species composition, root architecture, and soil chemistry point to deliberate agroforestry on a scale that mimics, or even surpasses, ancient orchards and managed woodlets elsewhere. What satellites first recorded as texture differences, patches of canopy that did not conform to surrounding randomness, became, through ground surveys, evidence of planned planting. Certain plots show a dominance of economically valuable species, Brazil nut trees in rows, palm stands spaced regularly, and fruit-bearing trees managed to produce staggered yields through microclimate manipulation. Soil samples beneath these stands consistently reveal Terra Preta concentrations, charcoal fragments, and evidence of organic amendment, clear signs that humans not only planted but enriched and maintained these living gardens over centuries. Age estimates for some core trees, combined with radiocarbon on soil layers, suggest multi-century management stretching back to at least 500 C and intensifying in the first millennium. The historical implications are broad. Such agroforestry challenges the idea of a pristine forest untouched by human hands, showing instead a landscape intentionally curated to increase productivity and biodiversity, food forests rather than tamed fields. This model of land use supports sedentism, population stability, and craft specialization because it reduces the need for clearing and allows for continuous yields over large areas. Competing theories nuance the scale and intention. One reading argues for the existence of managed commons, community-managed gardens producing staple and luxury species under shared rules. This fits with evidence of shared features, communal roads, plazas, and integrated water systems. Another proposes that such gardens were the domain of elites, who controlled access to high-yield trees and used them as leverage in political economies. A third, ecologically driven perspective emphasizes the coevolution of people and ecosystem, where indigenous fire management, selective planting, and soil amendment led to a managed but resilient forest system. Local narratives enrich this picture. Some elders recount the places where their grandparents planted trees whose fruits seem to appear on a precise schedule, a living calendar of harvests. Other stories speak of hidden groves guarded by families, where the most valuable trees, those yielding medicinal barks or rare resins, were kept behind ritual protocols. Picture walking through one of these lost gardens under a sun mottled by leaf shadows. You pass under a canopy where food is arranged like a banquet, where trails lead to fruiting palms, and where soil smells of rich earth and charcoal. The sensory intimacy of such places, taste, smell, touch, makes management a daily, tactile practice. Yet despite the clear botanical and soil evidence, questions linger about property regimes, the labor systems that maintained such expanses, and how these gardens shifted with climate and population pressures. We still don't know. As we peel back layer after layer, obsidian pathways and sky monuments, water mirrors and lost gardens, a cumulative portrait forms, one of a humanized Amazon both grander and more fragile than earlier models suggested. These revelations do not erase the mystery, they deepen it. They force us to imagine societies capable of reshaping ecosystems, of forging long-distance ties, of composing public spaces that echoed with sound and sky. At the same time, the data push us to be cautious. Satellite lines can mislead, small samples can overstate patterns, and oral traditions can romanticize or rework the past for present needs. The balance between bold inference and careful restraint is where archaeology earns its keep. It is the artful conversation between data and doubt. We still don't know. The echo bones, buried accumulations of unusually large human and animal remains that local stories have long whispered about, and that modern surveys sometimes encounter as glimpses of something both biological and symbolic. In certain raised mounds and buried terraces, excavations have turned up bones that, at first glance, seem outsized. Femurs thicker than expected for the average pre-industrial hunter, rib cages that suggest chest capacity greater than the paleodemographic averages for the region, and in a few cases, partial skeletons arranged in ways that imply deliberate placement, skulls placed on small stone platforms. Long bones aligned to point toward a particular star at certain times of the year. Radiocarbon dates on associated organic material vary, clustering largely between 800 and 1400 C. Yet with scattered earlier and later contexts that hint at long-standing practices around these deposits. How to read such bones is a delicate and contentious task. Do they indicate a population of larger-than-average individuals, differential preservation of larger specimens, ritualized selection of bones, or simply the tendentious imagination of those who find them? The measurements matter as much as the myths. The bones themselves are not supernatural, but their arrangement and the contexts in which they appear open the possibility of ritualized behavior tied to ancestry, power, or contested memory. Archaeologists proceed cautiously because biological claims can be explosive. One line of research suggests the larger bones are simply the remains of robust individuals, hunters and fishers whose diets and lifestyles produced stronger frames, and that selective burial practices emphasized prominent members of society. Another theory argues for osteological assemblages created through secondary burial rites, where bones from multiple individuals were collected after decomposition and reinterred in deliberate, meaningful configurations, an act that would be more about social memory than about stature. Yet a more sensational hypothesis, which has entered popular storytelling and local legend, imagines lineages of giant ancestors, people of exceptional size who once ruled or protected certain valleys. This mythic reading, while evocative, is rarely the preferred explanation among scientists because it often rests on anecdote and mismeasured remains. Still, myths themselves have value because they reveal how communities interpret the traces of an unsettling past. Key discoveries around echo bones include carefully placed food offerings, charred fish, cassava fragments, and carved bone pendants, suggesting these deposits were not mere refuse but sites of commemoration. In one trench, archaeologists found a cache of small polished stones near a skull that had been covered with ochre. In another, a ring of post holes suggested a temporary structure had stood above a bone deposit, perhaps for ceremony. Competing theories thus pull in different directions. One posits ancestor veneration and a culturally codified treatment of remains. Another reads the deposits as the aftermath of conflict, where the fallen were gathered and ceremonially arranged by survivors. A third envisions a symbolic performance where bones, both human and animal, served as talismans to anchor social identity. Picture yourself at twilight, stepping into a clearing where a few white bones protrude from the leaf mold. Your flashlight draws up the hollows and ridges of a skull, and you feel the gravity of someone else's memory pressing through time. These sites force a tender balance between scientific curiosity and cultural respect. We measure, date, and hypothesize, but the bones remain, in the deepest sense, vestiges of lives once lived. We still don't know. The glyph rivers, networks of petroglyphs and carved stones clustered along ancient channels and terraces, their motifs both repetitive and elusive, like a script only partially deciphered. Along old riverbanks, surveyors have documented carved slabs whose incisions form repeating crescents, cross-hatching, and spiral motifs. Nearby pebbles are pecked into symbolic groups and sometimes arranged in radiating patterns that recall sunbursts or the spokes of a wheel. These stones often sit near plazas or causeway junctions, as if they marked meeting points, boundary lines, or sacred way stations. Radiocarbon dating in the strata beneath some stones points to activity spanning 600 to 1500 CE, though some carved surfaces show signs of repeated reworking, fresh peck marks overlaying older patterns, suggesting symbols were renewed and reactivated across generations. Measurements of motif repetition and spatial clustering reveal non-random distribution. Certain symbols appear overwhelmingly near water nodes, while others concentrate near known Terra Preta fields. That patterning hints at a semiotic system where signs carried specific locative and social meanings. Interpreting these petroglyphs is a task of educated humility. One theory frames them as practical markers, signposts for traders and canoeists, marking safe crossings or signaling where a certain clan had rights to fish. Another reads them as cosmological, encoded maps of riverine constellations, mnemonic devices for seasonal rites, or diagrams tied to origin myths. A third approach reads them as boundary markers, assertions of territorial control written not on paper but on stone and earth, used to communicate claims without bloodshed. A fascinating subset of stones display paired motifs, two spirals or two crescents linked by a shallow groove, leading some researchers to suggest these denote trade partnerships or marriage alliances between groups. Additionally, the physical techniques used, pecking versus incising, depth of marks, and the choice of stone substrate, suggest the existence of skilled artisans whose craft carried both technical and symbolic weight. Myths enrich these scholarly frames. Elders sometimes tell of stones that change under moonlight, becoming luminous beacons for the lost. Other stories warn of touching certain glyphs lest one be bound into an ancestral pact. Picture running your hand along a carved spiral, feeling the tiny ridges smooth under your fingertips, and trying to imagine the hands that shape the groove, hands guided by purpose, by song, and by some shared understanding whose grammar we are only beginning to decipher. The ambiguity is part of the wonder. The glyph rivers are both map and poem, and until we can convincingly translate the motifs into lived meaning, the stones speak in elliptical fragments. We still don't know. The trade winds, patterns of seasonal movement and canoe-borne exchange that stitch the interior to the rim of the continent, where goods and ideas flowed in rhythms tied to rain and wind. Ethnographic analogues and ethnohistoric records show that river routes remain central to life in the Amazon, and when we combine those accounts with satellite-detected causeways, plazas, and market platforms, a picture emerges of a society whose circulation depended on precise timing. Canoes, paddled by families accustomed to reading currents and clouds, move goods not as isolated items but as bundles of obligation, pottery and manioc for salt and spondylus shell, obsidian for textile dyes, and prestige items for marriage alliances. The timing was everything. Traders planned movements around rising waters, seasonal winds that favor certain stretches, and ceremonial calendars that called for gatherings at particular places. Radiocarbon and dendrological data, when superimposed on modeled hydrographs, show peaks in activity correlating with periods where rivers were navigable deeper into the interior, implying planned mobilities rather than random drift. Measuring these networks reveals hubs and spokes. Larger plazas and sunken markets serve as nodes where goods were redistributed. Causeways and sky lines act as spokes facilitating movement across otherwise challenging terrain. The logistics required knowledge and social coordination. Who controlled canoe construction? Who maintained portage routes during low water? Who organized market times? Competing theories debate whether trade was centrally planned, regulated by elites who extracted surplus for redistribution, or socially embedded, managed through kin-based reciprocity and ritual exchange without centralized markets. A hybrid model seems plausible. Some nodes likely served quasi-administrative functions, maintaining stocks and mediating disputes, while smaller gatherings remained governed by reciprocal obligations. Oral traditions tell of wind people, who navigated not only waters but social obligations, understanding the moods of rivers and the expectations of neighbors. Imagine being in a long, narrow canoe under a wide sky, the paddles barely making noise, a woven bundle of shells and dyes at your feet, the outline of a distant plaza rising like a mirage. The wind and water are not just physical forces. They are the medium of social life, carrying gossip, alliances, and goods. In the end, because so much of this network depended on seasonal patterns and non-permanent infrastructure, substantial questions persist about the stability and reach of these trade webs and how they transformed with climate swings and post-contact disruptions. We still don't know. Across these new segments there is a recurring theme. The Amazon yields evidence that can be read in many registers: ecological, technological, social, ritual, but each register remains partial until we stitch them together. The echo bones invite reverence and restraint. The glyph rivers promise a script we are only beginning to read. The trade winds suggest a choreography of movement that made the basin legible as an economy and a cosmology. Each mystery resists tidy closure, and that resistance is not a failure of methodology so much as an honest accounting of human complexity in a landscape that both preserves and erases. Picture all of these places: causeways, plazas, canals, monuments, bones, stones, markets, overlaid in your imagination, a palimpsest of lives oriented to water and sky. Consider the people who tilled soil darkened by charcoal, who carved signs into stones, who paddled for days to exchange shells for beads. People who lived, loved, fought, and sang in ways both utterly particular and strangely familiar. And hold, too, the ethical responsibility of this work, to interpret without silencing descendant communities, to measure without reducing, to be guided by evidence but humble in claims. We still don't know. By now the images have piled up in your mind like river silt, layers that build meaning slowly, then all at once. Think of the causeways and the sky lines as a kind of scaffolding for human life, the ringed clearings and great plazas as stages where people gathered to sing, bargain, mourn, and decide. Consider the water mirrors and river grids as both pantry and altar, where food production and ritual overlapped in messy, beautiful ways. Add the iron cache and obsidian trail to that picture. Objects that traveled, were treasured, and helped stitch distant places together, and you begin to see a network not unlike the webs that hold cities in other parts of the world. Flows of people and goods, flows of meaning and obligation. The Amazon that emerges from the satellite's cold eye is neither empty nor accidental. It is the residue of choices, a topography of human intention where patterns that once guided everyday life lie disguised by canopy and time. When you stand back and let these pieces resolve, a causeway here, a plaza there, a pattern of charcoal-rich earth in between, you discover a civilization of sorts, an archipelago of interdependent centers, each shaped by local ecology and shared practices, each connected by water, road, and story. It is important, in this moment of synthesis, to hold two truths at once. First, the scale of human alteration is more impressive than many of us expected. People burned and buried, piled and channeled, planted and selected. They engineered soils and raised fields, creating fertility where the default was thin, leached earth. They carved stones and inscribed signs, they forged or traded metals, and they organized space with a clarity that reads on infrared and LIDAR like signatures. Second, the past resists tidy narratives. The same features that look like roads could be ritual processions. The same plazas that could hold markets might have been stages for drama or courts of law. The echo bones remind us that the dead are not mere data points. They are people whose lives and deaths matter deeply and whose afterlives were curated by the living. The glyph rivers speak in symbols we can only partially decode. They ask us to be modest about our certainty and generous about the range of meaning human beings can encode in stone. This tension between impressive engineering and stubborn ambiguity is precisely what makes these discoveries urgent. On the one hand, they rewrite textbooks. Population estimates must be reconsidered. The idea that rainforests were pristine before Europeans must be revised, and the scale of pre-Columbian human ingenuity in lowland South America must be acknowledged in global comparisons of early complex societies. On the other hand, these revelations arrive with humbling constraints: sampling bias, post-depositional change, the selective nature of preservation, and the deep imprint of colonization which both erase people and displace their stories. When a satellite shows a perfect grid, we must not rush to crown kings and palaces. When we find earthworks, we must not leap to militaristic explanations. We balance, instead, on the edge of probability, constructing narratives that are cautious but brave enough to imagine the social worlds that could have produced such traces. Beyond scientific reassessment, there is an ethical wake-up call. Much of the Amazon is home today to communities whose ancestors may be the very people who carved these landscapes. Their lived knowledge of plant cycles, of canoe craft, of stories tied to particular bends of river, should not be an afterthought in our archaeological appetite. Collaboration is not charity, it is necessary methodology. Indigenous narratives and current land use practices can illuminate how ancient systems functioned, how gardens were maintained across generations, and how rituals linked ecology to kinship. At the same time, archaeology must avoid reifying indigeneity into a static past. Peoples preserve their cultures by changing them. Their memory is not fossilized but adaptive. Listening carefully, then acting responsibly, means creating research that is co-designed, that shares results, that protects sites from looting and appropriation, and that respects the sovereignty of living communities to interpret their past on their own terms. There is another layer to this ethical dimension, one that addresses the public imagination. Popular tales of giants, cursed stones, or secret cities glitter with the same human hunger that fueled early explorers' accounts, but they run a risk. Myths can overshadow rigor and incentive looters. The thrill of discovery must be tempered by an obligation not to become sensationalist. Science and storytelling need one another, but the storyteller bears responsibility to be accurate, to avoid collapsing hypothesis into legend, to present uncertainty as part of the wonder rather than as a gap to be filled with fantasy. When we speak of echo bones or sky monuments, a careful narration acknowledges the mythic resonance while clarifying what the evidence actually supports. That level of honesty builds trust with audiences and protects sites from damage driven by treasure hunt fantasies. So what does it mean, practically, to take these discoveries forward? First, it requires sustained, interdisciplinary work. Satellites and LIDAR have given us the map. Soil chemistry, paleoethnobotany, osteology, and experimental archaeology must do the labor of interpretation. We need more cores, more controlled excavations, more community-guided surveys. We need conservation frameworks that protect sensitive organic deposits, timber platforms, peat layers, and Terra Preta, from erosion, drainage projects, and illegal extraction. Scientific funding should be attuned to the slow, patient work of building datasets that can withstand scrutiny and change over decades. We must also refine our tools. Remote sensing gets better year by year, and machine learning applied to LIDAR and multispectral data can help find the faintest signatures. But algorithms are only as good as the training data, and those data must be rooted in ethical, ground truth contexts. Second, recognizing the past scale has present-day implications for conservation and climate policy. Terra Preta, for example, is not just an archaeological curiosity, It is a model for long-term carbon sequestration and soil fertility. Understanding how ancient people created and maintained fertile soils offers lessons for sustainable agriculture that do not rely on destructive clear-cutting. Wetland management insights drawn from ancient canal systems could inform modern flood control that works with seasonal rhythms rather than against them. The human-shaped Amazon is not a failure of nature, it is a testament to an ethic of cohabitation, sometimes sustainable, sometimes exploitative, that we must learn to read and, where appropriate, emulate. Third, there is cultural heritage to be protected and rightly interpreted. The networks we infer, trade winds of movement, nodes of exchange, ritual architectures, speak to social forms that deserve recognition and respect. Museums, media, and educational systems must shift narratives from the virgin forest trope to one that honors indigenous ingenuity and sovereignty. This means changing exhibits, textbooks, and public messaging so that they reflect nuance. A rainforest that is both wild and cultural, a past that is complex and continuous into the present. It also means legal protections and collaborative stewardship, ensuring that archaeological work benefits communities materially and culturally rather than extracting their past as a spectacle. Emotionally, the arc of this story brings us back to humility and awe. Imagine the centuries when plazas rang with voices, contracting, negotiating, performing, the same need we have today to gather, to be witnessed, to orchestrate public life. Imagine mothers tending fish ponds in the water mirrors, smiths tapping out small metal ornaments by torchlight, teenagers trailing along causeways on errands, elders mapping stars on slabs of stone. Their lives were ordinary and extraordinary at once, shaped by seasons, kinship, and a set of technologies and rituals that were inventive and localized. The human capacity to make meaning, via signs, structures, and stories, reaches across environments. When we detect alignment lines in a canopy or red charcoal lenses in a core, we are witnessing, at a distance, an intention to be remembered. That is the most tender, most powerful part of archaeology. It is human beings, across time, insisting that their actions mattered. So what do we, as listeners and viewers, carry forward from this reflection? First, an invitation to curiosity tempered by patience. Know that quick answers are often insufficient, and that the thrill lies in a process of long attention. Second, a call to stewardship. These sites, whether visible from satellites or hidden under leaf litter, are fragile and deserving of protection that respects human rights and ecological integrity. Third, a reminder about our own epochs, our actions today, how we manage soil, water, and forests, will be the signatures future satellites read. The Amazon's hidden zone is not only a story about what was, it is a mirror on what will be remembered of us. And finally, a moral that is both bleak and hopeful. Complex societies can flourish in conditions once thought hostile, and they can also vanish under the twin pressures of disease, climate shifts, and external violence. The traces we now unearth might be palimpsests of resilience and collapse. That ambivalence is not an endpoint but a lesson. It tells us that human creativity is boundless, that stewardship is possible, and that the fragility of social forms demands humility. It asks us to imagine futures where we learn from the past's craft, its soil amendments, its calibrated waterways, its social webs, while avoiding the extractive mistakes that too often accompany short-term gain. So as we fold these threads, the plazas, the canals, the rings, the stones, the markets, into a single narrative arc, the conclusion is less a tidy resolution than an ethical charge. We are heirs to a landscape that remembers, and we have a responsibility to listen carefully, to protect deftly, and to tell truthfully. The Amazon's hidden zone beckons, not as a treasure chest to be plundered, but as a library to be read with reverence. Keep your curiosity sharp, your claims humble, and your hands steady when you touch these places, for they are the fragile remains of human imagination writ in earth and water. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.